All right, so maybe we should start. And I just want to first introduce myself. Like my name is Kartet Sang. I'm a professor at the Factor Inventors Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto, and I have been there for a long time, uh, over 3 decades. And Over the last long while, I have been involved in working with ethno-cultural communities. Although I am not self-identifying as a full-time immigration researcher, uh, I do other things, but like immigration research, settlement service, uh, have been a key part of my research and community service program. And I emphasize that because I think I spend um, equal time, if not more time, uh, in like working with communities, like going out to settlement organizations, developing programs, working with immigrant communities, uh, as much as I spend on research. My primary passion is actually about making a difference through direct service to immigrants, help them develop strategies and skills when they're adapting to the new country, but also at the same time building communities and building capacity. Uh, some of my team members that you're seeing here today have actually been involved with my other projects as well. I just want to tell you about uh, something about this project, and then there's another almost parallel project that we just completed. So I just want to openly acknowledge that this particular uh, study that we're reporting on is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This project is funded between 2022 and 2026. This study explores primarily the inter-ethnic group dynamics. And this is like a continuation, actually, of my decades of work in this area together with my colleagues who have been looking at different aspects of immigration in Canada and some of the global trends. And one of the things that we have noticed is that the traditional paradigm about immigration has become increasingly irrelevant and inaccurate. The general assumption in the traditional paradigm is that people from countries belonging to the global south will move to countries in the global north, and then there is supposedly a mainstream culture uh, primarily dominated by Euro-American structures and contents, and then like these new immigrants will have to adjust and integrate to that mainstream. In huge metropolitan or cosmopolitan centers like Toronto, we find that it is no longer an accurate description of what is happening. Uh, Over half of the people who are now living in Toronto, for instance, were not born here. So we're dealing with a new situation, and that has been happening for quite a while. So this is why we want to approach the whole immigration issue from an expanded perspective, which like takes into global realities. And we believe that it is instead of like looking at how minority groups have to fit in with the mainstream, we may want to be looking at like what is actually happening when like a lot of people coming from diverse backgrounds are coming together. Another key feature that I want to emphasize is that like in a lot of the traditional immigration research, we have uh, neglected or eclipsed the indigenous reality from the conceptualization and now discourse. In places like Canada or the United States, if you want to, uh, Australia, New Zealand, and other immigrant receiving countries, there is an indigenous reality which has traditionally been neglected. And we do not think that is like the best way to approach this. So in our study, we have like actively sought out to connect and interface with our indigenous communities and their leaders. And we got very inspired through our conversation with them, like starting about 2.5 years ago. Indigenous communities and leaders, we were having a conversation with them, and they raised an interesting perspective about how indigenous people and immigrants are routinely marginalized or even outright excluded from the exercise of nation building. And we do not get to participate to define what our country is and where it should be heading. And we're actually quite encouraged that over the last while, at least in Canada, that voice is gaining a wider audience. So people are recognizing that we are uh, involving and engaging our indigenous people and as well as like the immigrant communities to uh, participate, not just like by looking like because the whole idea of like immigrant and immigration will take on a completely different meaning. You take the indigenous perspective, right? So and I think on that note, what we are hoping to accomplish is not just like share some data, which we will, uh, but we are also hopefully contributing to modifying the discourse in this line of research and scholarship. So I have already said enough. So, like, I just want to like quickly compliment like what I said earlier. I said I have another project that is like almost parallel in terms of timing. Is that I have also received funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to lead a partnership development project focusing on Muslim communities in Ontario. And that has just been completed in August. And as a result of that project, we have actually expanded our partnership with Muslim communities, not only in Ontario, but like in other provinces as well, including Alberta and British Columbia, and in the northwestern territories and the maritime provinces. So we are in the process of like thinking of moving on to the next stage. So that sort of like gives you a better idea of who I am and what I stand for and what are some of the things that I'm doing. The Muslim Project again is hopefully getting public awareness and also producing knowledge and information regarding the social service needs of Muslim communities in Canada, and hopefully that will lead to appropriate responses like service programs and community development. So I've given you like maybe too long an introduction, but I hope that it's helpful in contextualizing the work that we're doing in this particular project that you're about to hear about is we actually cover 4 provinces in Canada, including Quebec, which, as you know, has a very special Francophone reality of its own, and Ontario. And Alberta, you're going to be hearing it from Carla herself, and British Columbia, which is on.
Oh, what happened? Tad, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I just got locked out, so
Yeah, I think it happened to everyone.
oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I'm about to finish my introduction. I was talking about how this is like a multi-site study covering different jurisdictions in Canada, which also shows you uh, diversity that we have as a country in terms of like the dynamics that you actually observe on the ground, and there are also like different policies and service programs in the different jurisdictions. So I'm going to like stop my presentation, my introduction here, and hand over to my team members. So Jemima, are you going to be
Mhm.
convening the Ontario part?
Yes, thank you, Tad. Thank you for the introduction. And hello, everyone. My name is Jemima. I'm the research coordinator for this project. So for today, we're going to talk more on Toronto side and Alberta from Carla. So from Toronto specifically, I just wanted to quickly share if people can see the slide deck yet.
I think I need host access if possible.
Oh, okay. If I can also share if
Yeah, if anybody from our team
yeah,
is able to
or
get access.
Shipping, can you share screen? Oh,
Okay,
okay.
I have access now. I
Okay.
can share
So
it. It's okay.
that's okay. That's okay. Thank you. So we're gonna see the slide, but the title of our presentation today for Toronto side is Service Delivery Principles and Toronto Shifting Multicultural Settlement Service Sector. As Tad has mentioned, we are funded from SHIRT, and it is a multi-site project. In Canada, we have Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal. And we have an international collaborator as well from Oneontai, New York, and Taiwan and Hong Kong. But today, in this first section, we'll focus on the GTA area, on our findings as we work nationwide to understand the issue from both service user and provider. But for this today context, we're going to talk about the service delivery principles.
Can everybody see the slides? Or are they not showing?
Yes, I can see the slide.
Okay.
I think people have put in their tabs, so we can go to the next slide. Just to give an overview, we're going to talk about the reasoning of our presentation today and the research questions that we would like to answer and discuss throughout this presentation, and the findings from both lens, from the service provider and service user, and the summary and recommendations. So if you can go next. What is service delivery principles? So we define it as the core value guidelines that shapes how services are provided, not only what service are delivered. So service delivery principles offer a framework to ensure that service delivery is consistent, ethical, effective, and centered on the needs for client and the communities. And in settlement sector, which supports newcomer, refugee, immigrant, service delivery principles guides how service provider and community organizations interact with clients, service users, how to design programs, and collaborates across sector. And when practiced effectively, these principles not only improve the service quality, but also nurture a strong sense of belongingness, helping newcomer feel valued, included, and connected within their communities. So, from our definitions of service providers and from our research so far, we can go next. The questions that we would like to address for today's presentation, the first one would be to understand how service delivery principles operates in the settlement spaces by both service providers and service users in the context of inter-ethnic relationships. And the second one is to explore and examine how policy changes and institutional shifts shape the implementation and experience of service delivery principles across the settlement sector. And last is to explore how service delivery principles can foster a stronger interethnic relationships and promote a shared prosperity and enhance newcomer sense of belongingness within the communities. I'll pass it to my colleague Julie for the next part.
Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Dorfe or Julie. So basically, just want to give a background of our research setting. So over the past 2 years, we've seen like significant turbulence in Canada's immigration and settlement policy landscape. Immigration chaos have not only reshaped who is coming to Canada, but also changed the scale and timing of service demand across regions. At the same time, finding reduction and shifting policy priorities have placed increasing strain on the settlement sector. What we observe is a recurring pattern of funding spike and fades. So funding often rises sharply in response to moments of political attention, for example, during high-profile humanitarian crisis, and then drops just as quickly as priorities move elsewhere. This pattern makes it very difficult for organizations to plan sustainable or maintain consistent relationship with clients. I will go next. So like just a case example of Ukrainian refugee. As we know, in 2023, service provider described how the strong government response and funding for Ukrainian refugee create tension across the sector. Afghan settlement workers, for example, felt that their clients were being left behind. But just 1 year later, in 2024, the same provider found themselves in the opposite situation. Funding for Ukrainian regime was abruptly cut, leaving thousands of clients without support. The key point here is that policy does more than allocate resources. It shapes inter-ethnic relationship, feeling of fairness and trust within the settlement environment. These shifts at the policy level ripple into everyday interaction between service provider and the communities they serve. And we'll go next. And importantly, when funding is reduced, it not only limits program, but also destabilizes the relationship that hold the system together. Go next, please. So we can see here the first provider speaks for a place of relational frustration. This shows how instability in funding directly translates into instability in trust. Clients who have come to rely on these programs are left confused and disappointed. The second provider highlights the emotional cost on the other side of the relationship. Many describe this as an ethical tension, the weight of wanting to care fully for clients while being constrained by limited funding, fewer programs, and increasing caseloads. So we can see the combination of uncertainty, ethical strain, and emotional fatigue shows that funding cuts reshape the very conditions of care and trust in inter-ethnic relationship. We'll go next. So in contrast to the volatility of the past 2 years, the newly released 2026 to 2028 immigration level plans by IRCC represents an effort to restore balance. It focuses on sustainability, reducing temporary arrivals while stabilizing permanent resident admissions. The plan re-emphasized economy and regional needs through the provincial nominee program, while still maintaining humanitarian and family reunification priorities. Importantly, it kind of like introduced one-time measure to transition thousands of protected persons and temporary workers into permanent resident, signaling an attempt to bring stability and predictability back to the system. I will go next. So here we can see service delivery principle as a kind of bridge that helps translate big policy directives into everyday relational ethics. Even when funding is tight or program goals change, this principle helps provider maintain trust and inclusion. They make inter-ethnic relation possible because shared values like respect and equity can often connect and transcend cultural and systemic divides. And we'll go next. Okay, so basically our kind of presentation will have two sides, so a service provider and service user. And I'll also be presenting on the service provider lens. So can we go next?
Yeah, and I think we should also note that we're focusing specifically on data from our focus group discussions, so not individual interviews. So yes, we're working with like a more limited pool of data this time around.
Exactly. Thank you. So yeah, let me start the results section from the service provider side before I move to what we hear from service user. In the service provider focus group discussion, we were basically asking three important questions. What seems to be working well in their day-to-day practice? And second, what are the seeing tension or challenges, especially around inter-ethnic relationships and settlements? And finally, what kinds of changes or suggestions do they think will actually help? So across the focus group, our big message keep coming up. First, relationship building is really at the heart of their work, and is strongly shaped by staff positionality and inter-ethnic dynamics. Workers are very aware of who they are, their ethnicity, migration history, gender, language, all of that shapes how relationship unfolds. Second, language barriers and information gaps came up as the most constant draining challenge. It's not just lack of interpreters, it's also misinformation moving through ethnic networks and social media. Third, service provider points to structural disparity between different groups of newcomers and migrants. For instance, migrant workers in rural area versus refugee or families in big city, and how these differences intersect with ethnicity, status, and geography. And finally, they describe how organizations are trying to respond through training, cross-sector collaboration, and emerging indigenous newcomer initiative that aims to make service more collaborative and inclusive. Okay, I think, yeah, so let's start with the first finding, relationship building. Service provider talks about it as an intention process that starts right at intake and keeps going through every interaction. The standardized intake questions help them map out someone's migration history, current challenges, and goals. But what really builds trust is how they position themselves in relation to clients. One participant in the quotes on this slide says that, I think it's the previous slide.
The previous one. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. So yeah, sorry. So the intake question helped me map their situation, but trust only grows when they slow down and really listen to the story. So interactive relationships don't just happen because people share a language or a country of origin. They're built through ongoing work, positioning, listening, and addressing interaction after interaction. And we go next. Yeah. So here, service provider describe client as multi-layered, people whose ethnic, gendered, and migration identities intersect in complex way. Labels like Syrian refugee or Filipino caregiver might be a starting point, but they're never enough to capture what's going on in someone's life. That has two implications for interethnic work. So first, staff try not to essentialize based on ethnicity. Shared language or background can be an entry point, but they don't treat it as the whole story. And second, when there is a clear distance, for example, a worker knows they have more privilege or hasn't lived through war or extreme precarity, they try to lean into empathy and humanity instead of pretending sameness. So overall, relationship building is about constantly negotiating difference and connection at the same time. We'll go next. The second finding is language and information. And service providers are very clear that this is a foundation for everything else. Across all groups, they said language barriers are the most frequent challenge. Many clients have limited English skill, but funding for professional interpretation and translation just doesn't match the need. As a result, communication often gets mediated through co-ethnic or multilingual intermediaries, bilingual colleague volunteers, or family and community members. These intermediaries are vital, but they're also quite ad hoc and uneven. On top of that, service providers spend a lot of time untangling misinformation coming from ethnic networks, unregulated organization, or relatives aboard. Clients arrive with strong expectation based on a cousin, a WhatsApp group, or a lawyer back home. Even among service providers, there can be confusion when immigration policy or rules shift quickly. So you get frequent misunderstandings and miscommunication in service encounters. For them, language isn't just a technical issue, it's a central side of negotiation and power of interethnic relations. And we can go next. Yeah, the third finding takes us to the structural disparities. Service provider access to notice how different groups of newcomers and migrants occupy very unequal position in terms of resources and risks. For example, migrants workers in rural or semi-rural areas face multiple constraints. Many speak Spanish, Thai, Vietnamese, or other languages with little local interpretation. They work extremely long hours. People describe it as sun up to sundown. So they have very little time or energy to seek help. And unlike in big cities, they often have limited local legal service or settlement counselors. The quote at the bottom of the slides here gives a sense of scale. One worker talks about essentially no legal or settlement support for around 21,000 migrants workers in their region. The trust building during COVID is now turning into visible frustration as service strength. So service provider migrant worker relationship here are happening in a landscape where labor regimes, geography, and funding decision heavily structure what's even possible. We'll go next. Okay. And then structures disparity also showed up for other groups. Service providers describe refugee and people from war-torn or highly precarious contexts as arriving with significant trauma and heightened mental health needs. But the support available are often limited, especially those that are culturally and linguistically matched. They also face severe housing precarity. For example, long wait lists, strict rules, shelter times limits, that spills over into kids' schooling and family stability. One service provider talked about children changing school repeatedly because the family has to keep moving. So the key takeaway here is that the interethnic relations are not happening on a level playing field. They're shaped by migration status, racialization, local housing and labor markets, and the urban-rural divide. So when we talk about interethnic relations, we can't just focus on cultural or communication. We also have to ask who is carrying this risk and under what structural condition. With that in mind, the fourth theme looks at how organizations are trying to respond. Yes. So the fourth theme looks at organizational strategies, what service providers say their agency are actually doing to navigate these dynamics. One piece is training and professional development. Staff are attending sectoral training on settlement, employment support, trauma-informed practice, and so many others that they think might be helpful to their clients. These aren't magic bullets, but service providers generally feel they give them more tools and language to work with racialized power, trauma, and gender dynamics in interethnic encounters. Another piece is partnership and internal collaboration. Workers talk about strong referral pathway across programs, connecting clients to employment services, mental health support, food banks, housing help center, violence against women services, and so on. You can think of this as a kind of linking work. So staff are constantly stitching together different parts of the system for clients. That helps counter the fragmentation of services, which otherwise tends to land hardest on marginalized ethnic and status groups. So we'll go next. A really interesting finding from this study is the indigenous newcomer relationship building. Some service providers describe initiatives connected to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Partnering with Friendship Center, inviting Indigenous knowledge keepers or artists, and holding sessions where participants learn about both Canada's colonial dark history and Indigenous culture and teachings. For many newcomers, and even for some staff, this is the first time they encounter these histories in a sustained way. One participant said that it has really been a lesson for us as well. This initiative created a kind of triangular relationship among Indigenous people, settlers, and racialized newcomers. They move us beyond a simple host-newcomer story and situate settlement within broader processes of decolonization and reconciliation. So organizations are not only managing diversity, in some cases they are actively trying to reframe interethnic relation in relation to colonial history and Indigenous sovereignty. So we'll go next, please. Okay. Up to now, I focused mostly on challenges, but service providers were also very clear that there are things working well, and they really wanted those to be visible. Firstly, they highlight relational client-centered practice. Service providers spend a lot of time at intake and beyond getting to know people's history, identities, and goals. They deliberately draw on different points of connection, share language, gender, migration trajectory, even hobbies, while also naming differences and privilege. The combination is what they feel builds more nuance, respectful interactive relationships. And second, they point to early structured orientation. Multi-day newcomer workshops that cover housing, health, employment, family laws, and violence against women are seen as very effective. Those sessions reduce confusion, tackle information upfront, and make the initial settlement process feel less overwhelming. Linked to this point are community building space and activities. So, like festivals, seasonal events, language exchange groups, and home-like family rooms function as everyday infrastructures of belonging. They create low barriers chances for cross-ethnic interaction, informal networking, and peer support across different language groups. And fourth, service providers are proud of their cross-sector collaboration and referrals. They describe strong pathways within and across organization to food banks, housing help centers, mental health support, employment services, and VAW service. Those linkages help counter service fragmentation and allows for more holistic responses to complex situations. Finally, they talk about a growing commitment to equity-informed and decolonial practices. Ongoing training like in trauma-informed care and gender identity has given staff more tools for navigating racialized power, gender violence, and trauma in interethnic encounters. And emerging Indigenous newcomer engagement through partnership with Indigenous organizations and knowledge keepers is seen as a promising way to broaden newcomers' understanding of Canada and move beyond a simple host-newcomer binary. So for service provider perspective, these are the pieces that are already working and worth protecting. So we'll go next. And to close the service provider piece, I want to quickly pull out 4 clusters of recommendation that came through across the groups. First, language and information. Service providers say that if we don't fix language access, nothing else works. They're asking for stable funding for interpreters and translation, formal support for bilingual peers and volunteer roles, and clear multilingual orientations and policy information, so clients and staff aren't constantly fighting confusion and misinformation. Second is the structural support. They emphasize tackling housing and legal gaps, especially for migrant workers outside major cities. Some providers put in bluntly, if we're addressing housing and legal support we solve a large share for newcomers' everyday crisis. Third is the mental health and worker well-being. Service providers see big gaps in trauma-informed, culturally and linguistically appropriate mental health services. And they also highlight their own needs for supervision, debriefing spaces, and manageable caseloads to sustain this emotional and advocacy work. Finally, anti-racism and decolonial practice. They call for ongoing anti-racism training and stronger Indigenous newcomer initiatives. So interethnic work is grounded in and broader commitment to equity and decolonization, not just one-off workshops. Taken together, these findings and recommendations show that interethnic relationships are shaped not only in individual conversation, but through the system, resources, and history that surround them. Okay, go next.
Okay,
And
so
I'll pass down to my colleague for the service user lens.
thanks, Julie. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm gonna go with yes, because I can't hear. I can't see anything else. So I'm going to begin by going over some of the key findings that we found in the service user focus group discussions. And I'm also just going to be looking at my phone. That's where I have all my notes. So in general, we found that structural issues strongly and consistently impacted service user engagements with settlement services and service providers because it was on the basis of these structural issues that service users relied on the support of service providers and on settlement service organizations. So even though our study is based on interethnic relations, service users consistently and without being asked contextualized their answers when talking about these relations in the structural issues that they experienced, relaying how service providers were able to support them or maybe struggle to support them as they navigated these structural issues. So these issues, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, if you know anything about settlement, include access to housing, navigating the job market as migrants, dealing with barriers related to their legal status as migrants, which often concerns difficulties accessing certain settlement services and jobs, and struggles with the bureaucratization of the migration process. So when asked about their experiences with settlement services and service providers, service users often spoke about the structural issues and how the physical spaces of settlement organizations and specific programs supported them. So over here, you can find a few quotes, excerpts from our transcripts that demonstrate these key findings. So for example, in the top left quote, they're talking about the bureaucratization of the migration process and how migrants can be prone to making mistakes, which renders them more vulnerable. And of course, in relation to the policies discussed earlier as well, the service user in the bottom right, for example, is talking about how a lot of the changes within policies, migration policies that we're seeing, uh, puts them in a very vulnerable position, and it's not a very stable position either. So their instability mimics the instability of migration policies that we see as well, which makes it difficult for them to form a stable sense of legal identity as a migrant with pre-existing legal vulnerabilities as they're really trying to make Canada their home. So you can really see through these examples the kinds of larger structural issues that service users are navigating and how the role of the service providers can be really integral in acting as a bridge between service users and the complexities and difficulties of Canadian migration processes. So one thing that I really wanted to draw attention to is the conflation of service providers, settlement service spaces, and services and programs that are offered by settlement organizations. So there's three things here that we found through our transcripts were sort of being like conflated or viewed in the same light by service users specifically. So when we asked service users about settlement services more generally, they spoke about service providers, settlement organizations, and programs altogether, and they didn't really distinguish between the three. So the quality of individual service provider care and the support found within the physical spaces of the organization is sometimes viewed by participants as a reflection of the quality of the organization as a whole. So you might be wondering, why is this important? Why does this matter? And what are the implications of it? So this conflation really highlights the interconnected relationship between individual service providers' support and the helpfulness of different programs, both of which exist within the physical space of the settlement service. And this connection allows service users to meaningfully address their grievances as individuals who are systematically situated in vulnerable positions of varying legal status within larger structural migration processes and issues. So, as individual workers, service providers are perceived by service users as a microcosm of the larger functioning of a space that centers the needs of service users as they navigate the feelings of overwhelm, stress, and confusion that comes with migration. And so the spatiality of settlement service organizations provides a physical context through which Canada as a state and settlement as a process is continuously perceived and experienced by service users. So settlement service organizations are an important, accessible, interactive, physical, quote unquote, face of an otherwise faceless migration bureaucracy. And I will move on from there. So to talk about some of the skills that service users found effective or helpful, I first wanted to talk about how service users how service providers provided a lot of support to service users as they navigated the aforementioned structural issues. So in this quote, you can see the service user talking about how, regardless of the issue that they faced as a migrant, the service organization and the service provider by way of that, was able to support them through it, pointing to the vast capacity that organizations and providers have when it comes to supporting migrants. And then we also found that service users value service providers having certifications and qualifications that help the service users navigate these complex migration processes because it's a reflection of the service provider's expertise in the area. So we found that, like I think earlier in the service users section, that a lot of times service users may rely on people within their co-ethnic networks to share and provide information to each other about the migration process. But in this case, we're actually seeing a service user prioritize the expertise of a service provider who would have quote unquote outsider status that they might not share an ethnicity with when it comes to navigating these complex migration processes. And then we also found that individual service provider qualities of kindness and attentiveness are appreciated by service users in the context of them facing these larger, faceless bureaucratic structures that create difficult situations and emotional hardships for them. So just showing, like simply just showing acts of kindness and just listening to the service users was enough for them to feel humanized and develop a form of agency as they navigate these really tiresome processes. And over here, we can see in the quote that this service user is really emphasizing how warm the service provider that they worked with was. And this brings me to the next finding, which I think really echoes some of the findings that we just discussed in the service providers section, which was about how service providers really provide very important emotional support that's necessary to helping the service users navigate, again, these very difficult, complex processes. So in this example, you see that the service user talks about how the service provider demystified the process for them, which really helps to calm them down. So as we've been seeing so far with how overwhelming this process can be, the demystification and the subsequent like tranquilization or the calming down effect that it has is clearly very significant for our service users. Now, quickly moving on to the challenges and critiques that were noted by the service users. First, I focus on some of the structural issues that they draw attention to. So I want to note that some of the critiques, or a lot of the critiques that they had about their experiences had more to do with the structural issues that they faced and less to do with the individual experiences that they had with service providers. And then we also found that service provider support is limited within the confines of migration and settlement organizational policies. So addressing structural issues is limited to the structural confines that these issues exist within. So for example, in this quote, we find that the service user did go to a settlement organization, but they were limited in their ability to help due to the legal status of the service user as somebody who only held a work permit. So this limitation is very clearly connected to a larger overarching structural confinement that exists through the organization's role as the interactive, quote unquote, face of the state regulations regarding migration. And then moving on to some of the more interpersonal challenges and critiques that we found through the service user lens. First, we found that service users consider and have concerns about the varying levels of knowledge and support that service providers bring and how this differently impacts their applications. So the service user quoted here talks about how they're very clearly concerned about this because they notice that service providers with different levels of knowledge and experience provided different levels of support to the service user, although it's not clear if this occurred through ethnic lines. So on the one hand, although they I guess it goes hand in hand with the fact that they value the expertise of service providers, but there's concerns that this expertise exists at varying levels across service provider knowledge. And then in terms of the ethnicity, we found that there are interracial and interethnic dynamics within the service user service provider relations that impacted service user experiences in terms of receiving support from service providers of other racial and ethnic backgrounds. So in this example, we found that Black service users struggle to be supported by a white service provider, which also makes us think about the relationship between race and ethnicity and the role of whiteness and racial hierarchies in largely ethnicized migrant spaces which are often used to serve racially minoritized and marginalized communities. And so although our study focuses specifically on ethnicity, we can't really deny this sort of inherent interconnection between race and ethnicity that exists within Canada. And I think that this focus on race is something that we're going to try to explore a little bit more in depth through through later parts of our study as well. And over here, I have some recommendations, but just being mindful of the time, I'm not going to discuss them just because they're very similar to the recommendations that we just discussed in the service providers section. So I think I'll just move on from here. And I think this is the end of it from here. I don't know if I should pass it on to Jemima or Tat to end things off.
I think we can proceed with Carla if
Mhm.
okay. Because the Q&A would be later, right?
Well, thank you so much to my colleagues from Toronto. Please let me know if you have any trouble hearing me or if you need me to speak up. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat here. As has been mentioned, there are several sites involved in this national multi-site study, and I am serving as the Alberta site lead from the time when I was at the University of Alberta. I'm currently joining you today where I am institutionally housed at University of British Columbia, Okanagan. So I'm joining from Okanagan Nation territory. And I want to acknowledge that the participants and the places from which the presentation that I'll be sharing today is coming from is Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory. So lands of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, Dene, the Stoney Nakoda, and Tsuut'ina nations. And we've already heard from some of the previous speakers today about some of the rich findings that have come from this multi-year, multi-site project. And so I'll just briefly build on some of what's been shared, which there are parallels across the Alberta sites and the Toronto sites, but focusing specifically on the experiences and perspectives of newcomers and of service providers in terms of relationship building, and how it is shaped by positionality and interethnic dynamics. So in the Alberta site, we heard from service users, so newcomers and service providers from mainly, as you can see here, and as predicted, the urban areas of Calgary and Edmonton. So for both service users and service providers, that's the case. But we also heard from some smaller areas, including Red Deer and Leduc, which are located still within a couple of hours of those metropolitan areas, so just to give you a sense of who is represented in these. And so some of the preliminary findings, as I mentioned, are really happening against the backdrop of immigration policies over these last couple of years. And like the other sites, our interviews and focus groups took place in 2024 mostly, and in 2023, in the later part of 2023. And so just to kind of situate where these experiences or perspectives are coming from, are unique to that moment. And following our focus groups, we also know that there have been changes, as mentioned by my colleagues earlier. And so we're taking the current context and the context in which people were speaking from at that time into consideration, but also situating exactly when these experiences happen, as they might differ from what is currently happening now or in the last couple of months in terms of discourses. And so again, inter-ethnic relationships and this critical piece of the work in navigating settlement services are established and play out in the context of providing and receiving these supports, and being situated to need these supports by a system that is much broader and at times faceless, as my colleagues mentioned. And so service providers provide faces to this faceless system in interacting with service users and newcomers. Many of these interactions were considered transactional, and the support was often viewed as described as mostly practical resources, but some of them also offered supports beyond what was practical, addressing social and emotional needs, again, as mentioned in the previous presentation. And so this approach was viewed by newcomers, not only in terms of navigating logistical challenges like housing and employment, but also fostering a sense of belonging and emotional well-being. And for many participants, this combination of practical help and emotional support was really critical in their process of moving and adjusting. Challenges were also described by newcomers and service providers, and so both reported wait lists and overwhelmed services. Many participants cited difficulty in not even knowing what kinds of help to ask for. And at the same time, service providers were seen to try to play a proactive role in anticipating newcomers' needs, while acknowledging that there are gaps in accessible information asymmetries, and also the bureaucratization, which was seen to be quite overwhelming by some newcomers. Many newcomers reported positive experiences. However, some also described moments of distress and disempowerment. And a key issue was the perceived power imbalance between service providers and service users, which often stemmed from the authority of service providers and being seen to determine access to essential resources, again, being the faces to this faceless system, which sometimes was perceived by some of the newcomers we spoke to as being dismissive or as condescending or preventing and creating barriers to access and supports. And one participant shared a long account of an experience she had in English classes. So again, a language being one of those key barriers, and it's here on this slide on the right here. So somebody from Calgary, and highlighting here the tone and the approach of how service provision can affect people's sense of dignity and their sense of self-worth. They highlight the importance of ensuring that services are not only accessible, but also delivered with empathy and respect. Again, relationships were seen to really be needed to be built on trust. And from the newcomer's perspective, they saw trust as being developed and created through reliability and follow through. So they were actually that was kind of the key thing that they look for, is that their first interactions would set the tone for the experience. However, what was really important for them was, did that service provider, did that service follow through? And did they circle back in helping to, in whatever need was needing to be addressed, and how that contributed to a sense of trust. Kindness and patience, this has already been mentioned, we're seen as really critical in helping newcomers feel more comfortable and in that trust building. And they made a significant difference in terms of their interactions with the rest of the services, and feeling valued, and feeling like they could speak without fear of judgment. Many newcomers also spoke about tending to form initial bonds within their own ethnic groups for practical support and comfort, because this provides a sense of shared experience and a sense of security while settling. An example, or this was shared with us, Telegram groups people joined in terms of, again, just navigating practical supports. And are especially helpful in those initial in those initial stages, and overcoming experiences they may potentially have. And so in this quotation here in Saskatoon, a newcomer shared how being connected to an employment counselor from the same country made it easier. So again, those initial shared experiences and shared identities providing a foundation at the beginning. At the beginning of their journey, but also at the beginning of their interactions with each other. It provided a sense of comfort, and of course, there is a lack of a language barrier that could be helpful. Again, going back to language, newcomers we spoke about developing bonds between different interethnic groups within classes, within training programs, and how participants really valued guidance around things like cultural behaviors from service providers and from these classes, in terms of being able to navigate this new environment. They often relied on observation to learn cultural norms, and this process was seen to be akin to, and an example being like holding a door open for someone, and learning how to navigate these new social spaces, and also be successful in trying to address particular needs like getting housing, etc. In trying to form interethnic relationships with other groups, some of participants spoke about being hindered by a fear of experiencing discrimination or racism, of reliving past trauma, in terms of developing new relationships. And they spoke about how these barriers can prevent them from fully engaging within their own communities, but also engaging with other communities in needing to form these relationships. This newcomer shared their experience of fear and skepticism about interacting with others. And they were unsure about what to expect, and worried about adding on to the challenges they already face. To add on to some of the other challenges that have already been described by my team members, trauma and fears of racism often acted as barriers to trust, making it difficult for newcomers to fully engage with services, to explore and develop relationships. However, when settlement agencies provided positive and culturally safe, culturally sensitive experiences, participants found that this helped them in trying to overcome their fears and feeling safer in connecting with others. A couple of last points here just to end. Service providers emphasize the importance of recognizing particular patterns and needs while also avoiding assumptions or stereotypes when working with newcomers. So there was this tension in terms of trying to understand the needs of a socially defined group of people and their layered subjectivity in terms of their various identities and the various groups that they belong with and unique needs. And at the same time, avoiding any assumptions or stereotypes that would lead to culturally unsafe care. Service providers who practice strategies like humor and kindness and empathy, those individual attributes, were also seen as even more effective in building trust. And reflexivity was really highlighted as a key factor by service providers in providing responsive care. Many newcomers had, just really briefly on this, as this was already raised by the other groups, so many newcomers had limited knowledge about histories and ongoing colonization and colonial issues in Canada faced by Indigenous populations. Some of them who were aware often expressed sadness and a strong desire to learn more. And at the same time, many of them described really needing to also, unfortunately, to focus on their own survival and to meet their own basic needs before they can really meaningfully engage and explore some of these more complex issues in their new home. On the note of this final note on relationship building and multi-layered subjectivity, many service providers spoke about using their own identities and experience to be able to advocate for their clients, particularly when their clients were facing negative treatment from within systems such as schools. And so they in a way leverage their own subjectivity to try to support them in ways in sometimes that are beyond their role. And so using leveraging their privilege to use aspects of power privilege that are more socially recognized to advocate for their clients and ensure that their needs are met. And this is an excerpt that highlights how advocacy is perceived by service providers to be a strategy that they use in their role, and how intersectionality helps to understand how these various identities can influence the effectiveness of advocacy efforts. And so a service provider reflected on whether their success in getting things done was it due to their position as a manager or their identity as a non-racialized Euro-Canadian person. And so this really highlights the complexities of navigating systems where power dynamics play a role. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, so we have till 4:30 in this session, and I just want to invite all the colleagues who are in the audience to now join us in an open discussion. Anyone with questions, comments, your own take on related issues, you're most welcome to share them with us. Because this is a virtual online platform, I cannot be like looking at facial expressions and use like eye contact and facial expression to encourage people to speak up. So I'll just have to do it verbally. So please, uh, if you have any ideas, questions, comments, please feel free to share. I think you can just unmute yourself and speak up, or if you want to, you can also enter your questions and comments in the chat. Like even like immediate responses or things that you can think of, like any ideas you think is worth sharing, you can either speak up or just like enter into the chat. Okay, thank you. Faye, please. Faye, do you want to just like unmute yourself and speak up?
Okay, sorry, I wasn't allowed to unmute myself. So, yeah, thank you so much for the team for the great research and presentation, because I just feel it's really practical and it's reflects a lot of barriers in the reality our organization encountered. We are OCC Communities Association. The name was Okanagan Chinese Canadian Association, established by Chinese Canadians. And during the past 15 years, we applied for funding again and again, but we got rejected because we were considered as a single culture. But actually, we advocate for multicultural activities a lot, and we have lots of different ethnic groups joining us. But that just create the barriers because all the racialized groups encounter the similar barriers, including the funding system barriers. So it's really meaningful project. And I just wonder if there's any way for us to access the complete report or the research result.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Like we are funded by SHIRC to do this research, and our responsibility actually is to disseminate findings and knowledge to people who need it. So the short answer will be yes. But the most effective way for us to be sharing results and findings with you would probably be like a direct communication, because like we have been preparing presentations at different conferences. This is not the first time we're presenting. Like I remember we've been to quite a few conferences presenting aspects of our finding and different with different teams, right? So we're more than happy to share our findings with you. So please just like reach out to us. I think can we just like give I'm just thinking of maybe just like entering my email, or is there a project email, Jemima, that people can use?
So we have a website, however,
Okay.
as we are still kind of doing
Yeah.
more disseminations and
Mhm.
preparing internally,
Mhm.
so we haven't updated the public website yet.
Mhm.
But if you want to keep your email, you can send it to me personally. I will keep you in the loop. Once we have the publications and the research report
Mhm.
ready, we will give you the updates.
Perfect.
Can people send it privately to you so that
For
it is?
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
for
All right.
sure.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
just put my emails there.
Okay.
And then if you want, you can keep it and then just email me afterwards, and then we'll keep you in our list of people that we will share our publications later.
Awesome, thank you. And I have another question. So I have commented this research is really meaningful and very excellent, high quality. I just wonder, will IRCC receive the summary of this kind of research? So how can this research result be submitted to the government, to all level of government funders? I think that's very important.
Mhm. Yeah, I think we like it is like it is routine for us to be preparing reports to the funders and also to policy bodies and different divisions in the government who would be looking after or funding um, settlement services in particular, because like settlement services is actually a focus. But as you're aware, we are working in 4 jurisdictions, and there are like regional variation in how the systems work. So again, the short answer is yes, we will be doing that. But like specifically on what topics and issues we may emphasize, then it will be probably more contextualized to the respective jurisdictions. But like we will be more than happy to talk to you, Faye, if you were interested in the process or you want to be part of the process, please get in touch with us. And I want have an additional response to your earlier question. Because like I've been around maybe longer than most people, I can tell you something about the historic development of settlement services in Canada. So we have like some of my colleagues have already showed to you that like funding and policy very often changes with geopolitical reality. So we just like showed you how like fundings for people from different countries have changed, like Ukraine, Afghanistan, and actually based on my own experience, I was also involved with the Syrian community in the earlier Syrian crisis. And back in the early 90s, we had people in the former Soviet Union who also came into Canada in large numbers. You mentioned about your organizations not being restricted to the Chinese community, which is great because before this project, the same team was actually involved in looking at intra-group dynamics within the Chinese communities, and we understand that the Chinese community is not a homogeneous community, but it is like a diverse community in its own right. And we have people from like mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, even like Latin America. So we realize we realize that like this like the trouble or the difficulty that you are running up against can be structural or policy, but it can also be reflective of the current priorities with the funders. So and we are also happy to talk to you if it is like of any help to you and see if like our research finding and our experience can inform your funding strategy as well. And we are happy to do that.
If anybody else also wants to share any of their own experiences as people who work in the settlement service sector, that would be really great. Because Faye, like we were just talking amongst ourselves right now, and we were like, we didn't know that you could face restrictions with funding if you're a single culture organization. So I think this is a great way for us to learn more, so that we could also like it helps to inform our research and expand our understanding of these issues.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, the system just didn't allow me to unmute myself. Thank you for your attention. I would like to say, in the past 16 years, our organization has applied for 4 times of IRCC funding, and each time. The first 2 times we got a rejection reason because we were considered as a single culture. Even we have Indian, not only Chinese, not only mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Malaysia, all the different diverse Chinese ethnic groups, but also Indian, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, lots of Asian cultures. We were also told we were considered a single culture. Although we demonstrated we were lots of Asian community members lead this community, and also later we will be joined Black community. So not only Asian even, we were still got rejected. So it's a kind of real systemic barriers, not only for one certain period, because 16 years, 4 rounds of every 5 years opening. I couldn't imagine how frustrated because I'm just taking over the role for the past 1.5 years. Before that, our community, older generation of leaders, they got rejected again and again for different level of founders. So I obviously would love to connect after this session and talk about how to make a change about the systemic barriers. I think it's very important. Thank you.
You're most welcome. So I just like I want to thank Faye for raising questions. We are now getting to the end of our session. So anyone wants to have the last word or last question, please feel free to do it right now, or else we will have to conclude this session. I want to thank everyone for showing up and joining us today. Even though we may not have a chance to talk to you directly, but you're most welcome to get in touch with us if you are interested in our work. We do look forward to at least like continuing this conversation with some of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Everyone.